Greetings, everyone, and welcome to Lost City Books. Thank you so much for being here today. We're so pleased to welcome Wayne and Aaron for this event. I'm very excited to hear about this book. But first, a few things. If you're brand new here, we are Lost City Books. We're a used, new, and rare bookstore, which we found out today we're one of the only ones in the city, if not the only one, that does that. So. I'd like to start with a few housekeeping items. The first and most important is please silence your cell phones out of respect to our speakers tonight. Those things can really be loud, so we want to hear exactly what they have to say today. Secondly, our speakers may unmask at the table, as you can see, but please keep yours on during the event for the safety of everyone here. We will have time for a Q&A at the end of the event, so if you have questions or comments, please hold them until that time. You'll know when. Lastly, if you bought your book ahead of time on Eventbrite, you can grab your copy downstairs at the front desk. It'll be down there with your name on it. If you haven't gotten your copy yet, we're almost out, so you know, first come, first serve for that one. And we can also order more copies for you. It's not a finite resource. Yet. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our speakers tonight. Wayne Hoffman is a native of Silver Spring and former resident of Mount Pleasant and DuPont Circle, two great areas. He has been a journalist for more than 30 years. After getting his start at the Washington Blade, he has written for the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, The Nation, Village Voice, The Forward, Slate, Out, and dozens of other publications. He is currently executive editor of the online Jewish magazine Tablet. Very nice. Wayne is also a novelist whose books include Hard, An Older Man, and Sweet Like Sugar, which is also based in and around DC and won the American Library Association Stonewall Book Award. He currently lives in New York City and the Catskills. Aaron Hamburger is the author of a story collection titled The View from Stalin's Head, which was awarded the Rome Prize by the American Academy of Arts and Letters and nominated for a Violet Quill Award. He has also written 3 novels, Faith for Beginners, nominated for a Lambda Literary Award, Nirvana is Here, winner of a bronze medal from the 2019 Forward Review's Indies Book Awards, and Hotel Cuba, due out from Harper Perennial in 2023. Maybe I'll swing back up. Without further ado, I welcome you to discussion about The End of Her by Wayne Hoffman.
Hello, everybody. Tell me if this is too loud. I don't have a problem speaking without a microphone, so I could do it without a mic, or do you need a mic? Microphone. Oh, microphone, right. For our virtual viewers. Hello, virtual viewers. And thank you to Shady for setting all this up. And thank you for all of you for coming out. It's nice to be back. This is home. I was born just a few blocks away at GW Hospital and spent the first half of my life in and around DC. So it's always great to be back, and particularly to be back with Aaron Hamburger, whom I've known since we were very, very young, since before I had any gray hair. So it's been a long time, 25 years. So I'm here tonight to talk about The End of Her, Racing Against Alzheimer's to Solve a Murder, which is a story about my mother and her mother and her mother. So what I wanted to do is start by reading a piece of the book for about 15, 20 minutes, and then Aaron will cross-examine me, and then we can open it up for anyone else's questions or comments. So I'll just dive right in to a piece of The End of Her. My mother's decline started with a laugh. On 4th of July weekend in 2009, I had just put a platter of lemon pepper chicken on the dining room table. Out of deference to my observant parents and my brother, who's a rabbi, I had bought kosher meat. On a religious level, the difference between kosher and non-kosher poultry is a matter of how the bird is slaughtered and prepared. But on a practical level, the difference is that kosher chicken costs twice as much, tastes twice as delicious, and is twice as big. One time, your Aunt Marilyn had some kosher chicken thawing in the kitchen, my mother began, launching into a story I'd heard years before. She had a plumber working on the sink, and while she was in the next room, she heard him say, "God, I've never seen such gigantic breasts." She was flattered, you know, it's not like either of us have what anyone would call gigantic breasts. So she called into the kitchen, "Thank you." Then she realized he was talking about the chicken on the counter. Everyone laughed. Mark and I, who were hosting at our weekend house at the Catskills, had seats at the head of our long rectangular table, while everyone else, my parents, my brother the rabbi, and his 3 sons, sat on the sides. What made us laugh wasn't just the story itself, or even the surprise of hearing a grandmother talking about gigantic breasts in front of her adolescent grandsons. My mother knew how to deliver a punchline, stressing the right words, getting to the laugh quickly, using exaggerated facial expressions and gestures, in this case, mimicking my aunt, looking down in disbelief at her modest cleavage. I kept bringing food out of the kitchen, and as my mother picked up the platter of chicken to pass it around, she launched into another story. One time your Aunt Marilyn had some kosher chicken thawing in the kitchen, she began. She had a plumber working on the sink. One of my nephews interrupted her. Grandma, you already told that story. My mother stopped. I did? When? About 30 seconds ago. She looked around to make sure we weren't teasing her, and then when it was clear we weren't, she fell conspicuously silent. No one else commented as the conversation shifted gears and moved on to other subjects. My family is very good at filling in silences. But the look on my mother's face, embarrassed and confused, troubled me through the rest of the meal. A few weeks later, she went to see a neurologist who diagnosed her with mild cognitive impairment. He couldn't give her a definitive prognosis, but told her there was nothing to worry about at this point. It was unclear if these memory lapses would continue or get worse. He'd keep an eye on her and we'd see how things went. Throughout my life, my mother's memories tended to be keen and detailed, particularly memories from her youth. Each detail came with a story, usually a funny one. Because if there's one thing everyone who ever met my mother could agree on, it was this. Susan Hoffman knew how to tell a story. Her stories were told with great skill and a knack for getting right to the funny part. But one tale she told wasn't so funny. It was the strangest set piece in her repertoire. When I was growing up in Jersey City, she began, I found a photograph in my parents' drawer. At just 7 or 8 years old, she recognized the man in the black and white photo, unsmiling, sitting in a chair with a trim mustache and neatly parted hair, wearing a stiff collared shirt under a jacket and tie, as her maternal grandfather, whom she called Zeta David, Yiddish version of Grandpa David. She'd met him only once, on a family trip to Winnipeg, the Canadian city where her mother Ethel had grown up. But the woman next to her grandfather in the photo, also stern-faced, but tall and narrow-waisted, with her hair swept upward, standing straight with one elbow resting on the chair in front of her, didn't look familiar. Who's this woman with Zeta David? My mother asked. That's my mother, came the reply. No, it's not, my mother said. My mother had met Baba Bela, Yiddish for Grandma Bella, on that same trip to Winnipeg. Baba Bela, she said, is short and fat. Baba Bela isn't really my mother. She's my stepmother, Ethel replied. This was my mother. And she turned the photo over. On the back, in pencil, was written a name my mother had never heard before, Sarah Brooks. My mother, surprised to learn her grandmother wasn't her grandmother after all, asked, well, what happened to Sarah Brooks? And this is what her mother told her. One winter morning when I was very young, my mother was nursing her new baby, your Aunt Anne, on our front porch in Winnipeg, when a sniper drove by and shot her dead. Ethel wasn't the kind of person to take kindly to being interrogated, so my mother, who was never one to talk back to authority figures anyway, simply accepted this as fact. The story became one of her favorites. She told it to my brother, my sister, and me many, many times as we were growing up. During Passover in 2010, the first family gathering after that fateful 4th of July in the Catskills, when we feared my mother's memory was starting to fail, I drove to Maryland a day before the rest of the family arrived, armed with a miniature video camera so I could record her tracing her family tree and telling her famous stories before she forgot them. The camera captured not only her memories, but also her emergent mental struggles, gaps in the narratives, key details and punchlines missing from familiar tales. A few moments of true forgetfulness where she'd stare into the camera with total blankness. She was already becoming unsure about facts she had once known by rote, which synagogue she attended as a child, or her cousins' names. My goal in making this video in 2010 wasn't to question her, but just to listen while I still could. Nonetheless, I could barely contain my good-humored skepticism as I prodded my mother to tell this tale of the drive-by shooting that the family somehow believes really happened. My giddiness rubbed off on her. She smirked as she told the story on camera, but neither of us ever said flat out that this legend was a lie. This was the story my mother grew up with, and she was sticking to it, no matter how unlikely it sounded. My mother didn't have a lot of time to sit and reminisce after we made that video. She still had to prepare for the Passover Seder. Half the Seder is sitting right here, by the way. I ran the service around the table, but she had to make dinner for more than 20 people. Matzo ball soup, brisket, and a turkey, and a spare turkey, because she was always needlessly worried that there wouldn't be enough food. The Seder went off without a hitch, as it always did. The night after the Seder, Susan and my Aunt Marilyn were sitting on the living room couch, going through a plastic shopping bag filled with old photos. Eventually, they came across the photo of Zeta David and Sarah Brooks, a sepia-toned 4x6-inch print mounted in a cardboard frame. As they looked at the photograph, the same photograph my mother had found more than 60 years earlier, the only photo of them in existence, they started to tell the story again. Passover is a holiday that specifically instructs us to tell stories about the ancient Israelites' exodus from Egypt again and again, so that future generations of listeners will make them part of their own histories. At our Seders, we also shared stories about our own childhoods, our families, and Passover's past, so that these too would become part of a history shared by everyone around the table. I'd held my tongue, more or less, when I made the video a couple days earlier, but this time I stopped my mother and my Aunt Marilyn in the middle of the story. I call bullshit, I said. First of all, who breastfeeds outside in the middle of winter in Winnipeg? Second of all, back whenever this was, the 19-teens, how many cars were there in Winnipeg? A dozen? And why on earth would a drive-by sniper, if such a thing even existed back then, be shooting at nursing mothers in broad daylight? And how could he have good enough aim with an old shotgun to kill her but leave the baby and her breast unharmed, all while making his getaway in a Model T? But that's the story we were told, my mother said. Why would we question it? Because it's so obviously not true, I said. My mother let this sink in. I wasn't just teasing anymore. I was calling her bluff. But if it isn't true, she said, then what really happened? That's when I started research for this book. So I set out thinking, I've been a journalist for 30 years, 30 plus years by now. How long is it going to take? I'll Google it. I'll find the answers in a week, 2 weeks. I'll tell my mother, we'll have a laugh. P.S. It took a decade. It took a lot of searching, a lot of effort, a lot of reaching out to people, a lot of going through archives and microfilm, double checking, trips to Canada. But I finally found out largely what happened, which parts were true and which parts really were bullshit. Short version of the story, almost everything my mother had learned was in fact not true. It wasn't winter. It wasn't outside. It wasn't during the day. She wasn't breastfeeding. It wasn't a drive-by sniper. The one thing that was true was the most important part. My great-grandmother was murdered. So I started searching to find out all I could about her, how she was really killed, and also how she had lived. And here's a little bit of what I found. My great-grandmother Sarah was born into a Jewish family in Russia in May 1887, the oldest of 4 children. As a teenager after her mother died, Sarah was pursued by a young man from a wealthy, powerful family in her hometown, the Ukrainian village of Dobrovoda. After he spent considerable time trying to woo her, she rebuffed him. Furious, he swore revenge. Even if it takes me a lifetime, he said. Perhaps fearing what her suitor might do, or perhaps more broadly concerned about a wave of pogroms starting in 1903 and lasting 3 years, taking thousands of Jewish lives across Russia and driving a massive wave of Jewish emigration. Sarah left for North America in 1906. Within a few months of her arrival in Winnipeg, she married David Feinstein on October 27, 1906. Born in Chudnov, a mostly Jewish shtetl of several thousand on the Teperovka River 30 miles southwest of the Ukrainian city of Zhytomyr, David had come to Canada in 1904 and become a naturalized Canadian citizen in 1906. He went into business with his 4 brothers as a cattle dealer. As newlyweds, David and Sarah lived at 633 Manitoba Avenue in Winnipeg's North End. Nearly all the Russian Jews who had come to Canada eventually settled in the North End, giving the neighborhood the name New Jerusalem, or to those less fond of the newcomers, Jewtown. When David and Sarah were married, the North End was a rundown working-class immigrant neighborhood. Most of Winnipeg's Jews, 4,000 by that point, lived there, the majority having arrived in the previous 5 years. But it was not an exclusively Jewish area. In fact, the vast majority of residents were Gentiles. Recently arrived Jews lived alongside other Eastern European newcomers, Serbians, Croatians, Ukrainians, ethnic Poles from Galicia, which was then an autonomous region of Austria-Hungary, in tiny houses built closely together along black muddy roads lined with wooden sidewalks. By 1913, my great-grandfather's cattle business was booming, and the family, including 4 children, had moved to a new house on Magnus Avenue in the North End, several blocks from the rail yards. The fine scenes were a prominent part of the Jewish community in Winnipeg, and things were looking up, but it wouldn't last. Nobody in the house heard the intruder fire a gun at Sarah's right temple as she slept in the early hours of Friday, August 1st, 1913. Even 2-year-old Fanny, curled up at her mother's breast, continued to sleep as the blood seeped into the sheets and dampened her nightgown. It was Anne, the infant in the crib next to Sarah's bed, who made the first noise shortly after 2:45 in the morning. She started crying, perhaps because she'd witnessed a stranger in the house, or sensed that someone had hurt her mother, although there were no signs of a struggle or confrontation. Or maybe she was just hungry and wanted to be fed. It wasn't unusual for Anne to wake up crying in the middle of the night, but it was unusual for the crying to continue without Sarah tending to the baby's needs. Harry, the oldest child, 2 weeks shy of his 6th birthday, sensed that Anne's crying was an indication that something was wrong. He got up from the room where he was sleeping alongside his little sister Ethel, my grandmother, and the family's current hired girl, a Ukrainian immigrant named Victoria Komanoska, and walked into his mother's bedroom in the rear of the house to wake her. When he couldn't wake her, he told Victoria, who tried to rouse Sarah without success. The small red light that Sarah typically left on during the night had been extinguished, so she turned it on, and then she saw the blood. Frightened and unsure what to do without Sarah's husband David at home, Victoria shouted to the Feinsteins' neighbor Lucy Kessler through the window, "I've been calling my mistress and she won't wake up." Then Victoria ran out the front door, which was closed but unlocked, something she noticed because she had locked all the doors before she went to bed, and Sarah had checked them as well. Victoria woke the Kasners next door at 516 Magnus Avenue. Lucy arrived first and accompanied Victoria to the back bedroom. While Sarah lay motionless with Fanny asleep by her side, baby Anne was crying in the crib. Lucy picked her up to comfort her. Robert Kastner came in next with a young man named Abram Shorman. Robert saw the bullet hole in Sarah's right temple, and Abram shouted at Victoria, "You're crazy. This woman's been shot." Abram ran back next door to call the police. The Feinstein house, like most in Winnipeg's North End, didn't yet have a telephone. Then he called 2 local doctors, Dr. George Hirsch Kalichman and Dr. Abram Berkovich, who had delivered my grandmother Ethel when she was born in 1909. Kalichman arrived first on the scene after 3 o'clock. He found Sarah in bed facing the wall with blood and bits of brain on her pillow. He pronounced her dead. Sarah's body was still warm, indicating to him she'd been shot in the previous half hour. Eventually, 2 police officers, Sergeant Rice and Patrol Sergeant Livingston, showed up from the North Winnipeg station to find Sarah in a peaceful pose, her cheek resting against her hands on the blood-soaked pillow, while her children lay on a cot at the foot of the bed, crying. The house was cordoned off, pending a full coroner's jury that he called for 5 o'clock that afternoon. Other than police, there were now more than 20 officers on the scene. The only person allowed inside the front gate was a representative of the local Chevra Kadisha, the Jewish Burial Society. girl she had recently hired. Sarah reportedly didn't approve of Mary's relationship with Stefan, a 24-year-old brakeman on the railroad who lived in a boarding house on Selkirk Avenue. After she was fired, the story went, Mary tried to convince 17-year-old Victoria, who had worked for Sarah since arriving in Canada 4 months earlier, to follow her out the door. When Victoria was scrubbing the veranda, Mary stopped on the sidewalk to admonish her. "Why do you work for the Jews?" she asked. When she couldn't goad Victoria into responding, she stepped up onto the veranda to continue her tirade. "The Jews were cast out of Russia," Mary told her using expletives, "and so they should be in Canada." Sarah came out of the house at this point and shoved Mary off the veranda. According to neighbors who claimed to have witnessed this exchange, Mary left, vowing revenge. As news of the murder spread through the North End, a crowd gathered outside the Feinstein's house. There were never fewer than 300 people on the street that day, barred from entering by a local constable who blocked the doorway. Journalists from Winnipeg's rival daily newspapers, the Manitoba Free Press and Winnipeg Telegram, both of which came out in the mornings, and the afternoon Winnipeg Tribune, spoke with onlookers digging for information, but like the police, who were talking to neighborhood residents in hopes of finding clues, they were faced with a language barrier, since locals tended to speak Yiddish or Polish or Ukrainian. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the Tribune splashed news of the murder across the top of its front page. "Prominent member of Hebrew colony shot to death while she slept," read the headline, 4 columns wide, above a large photograph identified as their wedding portrait, the same picture my mother would find decades later. Anti-Semitism was cited as the motive. The chief of detectives was reluctant to give many specifics to reporters that afternoon, but assured him he was on the trail with the investigation and would be in pursuit of the murderer by evening. Victoria Komanowska and Mary Monastaka were both taken to the Central Police Station and held as material witnesses. Stefan Kashowski had not yet been arrested, but he had been spotted. After allegedly skipping work at the rail yards, he appeared just before 9 o'clock at Feynman's Confectionery Store at 192 Andrews Street, around the block from the Feinstein's house. He bought a bottle of aerated water and sat on a box to drink it. He casually asked the proprietress, "What's going on Magnus Avenue to draw such a crowd?" "Don't you read the papers?" she asked. "Mrs. Feinstein was shot at 3 o'clock this morning." Stefan told her he hadn't read about the crime because he couldn't read English. Then he asked if anyone had been arrested. "Oh, yes," said the storekeeper, who recognized him as a frequent customer. "Mrs. Feinstein's girl, and the one that used to come here with you." Stefan knew she meant Mary, whom Stefan had brought in more than once to buy a pop. His lips started to quiver. He dropped the bottle on the floor, where it smashed into shards, and he fled through the doorway. As the sun set around 8:10 on Friday night, the Jewish Sabbath began. The police investigation was put on hold, since witnesses would be unable to provide testimony until the Sabbath was over. The coroner's jury, which included several Jewish members, was also paused as well. The funeral was put off for a day, since Jewish burials cannot take place on Saturday. But that evening, in synagogues across the North End, there were now more than a dozen of them. All the talk was of the young mother who'd been murdered early that morning. The next day, Saturday, August 2nd, David's train arrived in Winnipeg at 7:20 in the morning. The story of his wife's murder appeared in all 3 daily newspapers' Saturday editions. Journalists tried to interview David, but as the Tribune explained, he appears to have suffered terribly since the news was broken to him and was altogether under too much stress of grief to speak very much to reporters. Coroner Ritchie filed his medical certificate of death that Saturday. Cause of death was listed as bullet wound through brain, homicidal. On the same day, synagogues across Winnipeg were reading that week's Torah portion, Masseh, the final section from the book of Numbers. Preparing the children of Israel to enter the promised land, God tells Moses in Masseh to instruct his people to set up cities of refuge when they enter Canaan. But anyone who intentionally kills another person with a stone or wooden tool or iron object will not be allowed sanctuary there. That person is a murderer, the Torah makes plain, and that person must be put to death.
Thanks so much, Wayne. Can you all hear me? So by the way, if you have not acquired a copy of this book, I highly recommend that you do. It reads like the best thriller ever, and also a really tender and emotional story about you and your mother. And I actually thought maybe you could talk just a little bit about constructing a braided narrative. How did you go about sort of organizing that? Did the form emerge naturally, or is it something you planned ahead of time, or how did you keep it organized?
Oh, well, that's a bigger question.
Yeah.
It wasn't what I set out to do originally, because when I first started out, I didn't think it was a book. When I first started digging into the murder, I really thought it would be, a paragraph. I would find out the truth and tell my mother, and that would be it. It never occurred to me that it would take so many years and take so many different sources of information, and that I have to reach out to so many people. I wound up contacting more than 20 cousins who I had never even heard of before around the world, tracking them down so I could ask them questions. I never thought it would take this long. But since it took so many years, the process of doing research was actually in fits and starts. It wasn't like I worked on it for 10 years solid. I do have a job and also somewhat of a life, at least before the pandemic. So while this was happening, I would continue to dig in here and then take a break and dig in again. All this time, my mother's health is deteriorating, sort of right before your eyes. It's a horrible thing to witness. And that too doesn't go in a straight line. Her decline starts off sort of gentle and sometimes funny and sometimes annoying, but not really terrifying. And then all of a sudden terrifying. For us and for her. And then, now we've plateaued. And then, oh my gosh, I can't believe it's so horrible. And now it's really gut wrenching. And now it's okay. So my research was happening with this as the backdrop. And since that was happening, in my mind, they became intertwined. They became the same story. My quest was originally for my mother's sake, because I thought this is a story she's told her whole life. She's named in memory of her slain grandmother. As a sort of Ashkenazi Jewish tradition, you're named after a dead relative. So I thought it would be particularly meaningful to her, but it just became so much more of a conjoined story that I couldn't imagine telling one without the other, because by the time we got to the end and I finally found out what really happened, my mother was no longer able to understand what I had found. I thought I'd find the answers for her, and I found them, but it's too late. So to me, they're the same story. And it's a process of me trying to help my mother, who was the storyteller in the family, figure out the mystery behind this one story. And in the end, I've, by default, had to pick up the mantle of being the family storyteller. I'm the one who knows what really happened, but I'm also the only one who remembers the original story. She doesn't remember the original story anymore. There's nothing to correct. It's all gone. So in the end, it's my own project, not for her, but for me.
That's really beautiful. It's interesting. We do go back quite a ways, you and I. In fact, Wayne gave me my very first professional writing assignment in New York City when he was editing at the Blade News, and I was a young whippersnapper and barely moved in Manhattan for like a couple of weeks. Anyway, since then we've both written 4 books. We're both nice gay Jewish boys.
Absolutely.
And our first 3 books for both of us were fiction. And it's interesting that this one is nonfiction. And it's funny because my new book is also about my grandmother and my family history. But I wasn't as brave as you because I couldn't find the answers. I didn't know where to look for them, to really be definitive about them. And I wondered if you could talk about the choice to do this as nonfiction, and also some of the journalism skills that you brought to bear in order to investigate this very complicated story.
It's interesting. The line, as I learned decades ago, the line between fiction and nonfiction is blurry and somewhat arbitrary and kind of nonsense to some extent. I mean, I grew up as an adult reading Edmund White, which is almost all fiction that's extremely thinly veiled true stories. Sometimes it's not even thinly veiled, really thin.
Yeah.
And I know you've also written about your grandmother and the experiences in Cuba in nonfiction form because you've written them for me at Tablet. So I know some of that story as well. This time for me, since there are sort of 2 parts of the story, on the one hand, I couldn't imagine turning my mother into a fictional character because it was just so raw. And I didn't know how to do that. And I didn't want to do that. The point wasn't for me to imagine a man who was close to his mother. I was close to my mother and am. And that seemed more important to me than trying to create a character who had a relationship with his mother like I really do. It seems simpler, but more importantly, the crime, the murder was such an odd and very specific thing to research. If I had been researching a story about the broad history of Jewish immigration to North America, or even specifically to Canada, or even more specifically to Western Canada, because the book spreads from Winnipeg to unexpectedly Saskatchewan to Vancouver, it sort of goes all the way across Western Canada, then I might have been able to create fictional characters who embody different things I had found. But this one very specific moment was, for me at the very beginning, finding out what the hell really happened. I think if I had wanted to fictionalize it, it would have been more interesting to take my mother's bullshit story and write a book about that.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the next thing.
The drive-by shooting.
The
in
drive-by
Maltese.
shooting. The drive-by shooting and the nursing mothers on the front porch in winter, the crazy nursing moms outside. That would make it a great novel. This seemed like, looking at it as a journalist, the deeper I got into it, the more facts kept flooding over me. And I felt like I just want to get them down. I mean, everything in here is from a source. Everything, the temperature outside, how many inches the window was open, everything comes from newspaper stories. And I felt like now is the time as a journalist to do this, to do the factual reporting. And there's still, there's, I hope, some finesse in the writing of it, but the facts seemed like it was more important that I get all the facts together than that I create the narrative. And when I've written novels, that's not the case at all. It's more important to get sort of the deeper truth of the characters without necessarily capturing the specifics of an individual person. This time I felt like I wanted my mother. I didn't want a woman like my mother. I wanted my mother. I wish I could have gotten more of her on tape and told her stories as well as she did, because I can't possibly match her skills. But I felt like I really wanted to get the specifics, not the idea, but the specifics here. And that's something I hadn't done before.
At the same time, I feel like you did bring some of your skills as a fiction writer to this story. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, particularly as you're recreating these past scenes, which are all based in fact, but they read it like a great Agatha Christie story. I wonder if you could talk about that.
To some extent, that sort of comes together on its own once you keep reading the newspaper reports and realize how many details there are. Because looking into it, I don't have, the sources I had were newspaper stories from the time, and by the end I had probably 25 of them in English and Yiddish from across Canada, most in Winnipeg, but Montreal, Toronto, Vancouver, Saskatchewan as well. English and Yiddish newspapers were covering this murder. And just trying to assemble the story to make sure I had the facts straight and in the right order, so that things would be revealed in the order they were actually revealed. I had to try to imagine myself there. Like, what would it be like if I was there, if I was a neighbor and I heard this commotion, what would I have seen? If I was standing on the street that afternoon, what would I have seen? If I had seen the newspaper when it came out, would I have read it? Could I have read it? So it was a matter of putting myself actually on the scene, and that helps the narrative gel, because you're trying to walk through it and make sense of it. There's so many details spread across so many sources that trying to put them all in order and put them together makes it a scene. It turns into almost like a TV movie. Mm-hmm. Then what happened? Then what happened? Then who saw what? Then who said what? And who identified who? And who told what to the police? And were they lying, or were they playing a game of telephone? What's particularly fascinating is because there are 3 different newspapers covering this. Sometimes they're covering the same events slightly differently. So you get to really compare notes and also help you figure out, this newspaper is kind of BS. This newspaper seems like they care more about details. This one has quotes. This one does. I'm pretty sure they spelled that person's name wrong. That can't be their name. So you really get inside it and get to see who's trustworthy and who's a good narrator and who's not.
In a way, I think that the skills you build as a fiction writer and as a fiction reader, I would say, make you well equipped to then solve the crime, which the police were not able to do. But I think you figured it. So,
I think so.
Yeah.
What's funny, since the book came out, it's not just that this is the first memoir I've written, it's also the first time I've written anything about true crime. Mm-hmm. And that's a whole different universe of literature and readers, a whole very deep niche of readers. And when I've done over the past week, a couple of podcasts and radio shows for true crime people, the true crime fans have contacted me. And people who have connected on about the Alzheimer's story will often write me notes and say, my mother or my grandmother or my father also has Alzheimer's. I've gone through something similar and I can empathize. And they share their stories so we can mirror each other's emotional journeys. The people who read it as true crime are going through like they're trying to solve the crime again. And they're sending me notes saying, I don't know if you noticed, but there's this clue. I don't think you paid enough attention on page 72. Or did you ever find out what this was about? Brakeman said he had an alibi. What was the alibi? I don't know. They have a very different approach. It's fascinating.
I love it. I also feel like this book is a tribute to women. Your great-grandmother, your grandmother, your mother. I feel like there's more women in this book than maybe in all the other ones.
Yes.
Combined.
Yes, that is true.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit, about the women in this book and the process of writing about
women. It is very much a book about women. What was interesting for me was that at first it was a book about my great-grandmother's murder and my mother's decline. But there's also a woman in between them. And that's my grandmother, who was a witness to the crime, but as a small child. She's the one she was there, but as far as I can tell from my research, she's the one who made up this concocted story about the drive-by sniper that no one else in the family had ever heard of. It's only she made it up. I don't know where, I don't know why. That's the mystery I cannot solve. Like, where did this come from? Did she think this would be calming for her children and reassuring? There were drive-by snipers in Winnipeg. I don't know what she was thinking. But I really had to look at my grandmother, and my grandmother is someone I knew. My grandmother lived with us when I was 12 and 13 before she died. She died 2 weeks after my bar mitzvah in 1983. And I knew her. I knew her in two ways. I knew her as my grandmother, and she was a perfectly nice grandmother to me. I loved her. She wasn't the easiest character, but she was pretty funny. But I also knew her as my mother's mother, and I knew that she was really not, I'll be generous, she was not a great mother to my mother. So trying to see her and how she fit into this is like the connective tissue between two generations of women. My mother never knew her grandmother, my great-grandmother. That's how she's named in her memory. But there was a woman who knew both of them, and that was my grandmother, who I also knew. So I tried to sort of dig into her story as well, even though it's not about her, but she's the connection. And I remember her. So her life has particular meaning to me. I did know her and I knew her well. And writing the story, especially in the context of her mother who was killed and my mother whose life she kind of screwed up, gave me a new view of her and what it was like for her. I mean, my great-grandmother moved across the planet at 19. This is before, forget cell phones, this is before like phones, really. She moved across the planet to a place where she knew nobody as a 19-year-old girl and made a life for herself. And it was a pretty good one for about 7 years until it was a really bad one. And so I sort of got a good sense of her. And then I realized my grandmother did the exact same thing. When my grandmother was 19, she too picked up and moved to a new country. She moved to the States alone and lived as an independent young woman in New York City. She didn't get married for another 7 years, worked in Manhattan, lived in a women's residence, and was basically an independent woman out of the town on her own in a new country with no particular resources. She didn't come with money. She never did get money, and worked her whole life. And it made me see, oh, right, there's a sort of incredible bravery and chutzpah in what they both did. And they did the same thing at the same age. You might say, yeah, it's not as big a deal to move from Canada to the United States. But also at the time, it wasn't like she was going to run home or even pick up the phone because it was very expensive. She saw her father maybe 3 more times in her life. She saw her sisters a couple more times in her life. The rest of her family stayed in, by that point, Vancouver, and stayed very close. She up and left and started her whole new life in a new country on her own as a teenager, just like her mother had done. And it gave me a very different sense. And that's to look at that through the lens of how much more difficult that was for women to do. It was difficult for anyone to do, but for women to do that was extraordinarily difficult. And at the same time, trying to research people's lives, trying to research women's lives, particularly a century ago, is a very big challenge because they're hard to find in official documents. If you don't already know their married names, they vanish. If you don't know for immigrants, male or female, what English names they adopted, at least for the purpose of official documents, if not forever daily use, you can't find them. And then names kept changing their spellings in English. So my great-grandmother was born Shifra Averbrook. She took the English name Sarah. She shortened, or someone shortened, Averbrook to Brooks as her maiden name, which mattered for about 12 seconds before she was married to a man who was named Feinstein. And in the newspapers, she loses both her first and last name. She's Mrs. David Feinstein. She has no identifying name that I could connect to. And anyway, then the family changes the name to Feinstein. So Shifra Averbrook is Sarah Auerbrook, is Sarah Brooks, is Sarah Feinstein married, who's Mrs. David Feinstein, who's then David Feinstein. She's really hard to find. And the same was true with all siblings. All the female siblings were very, very hard to track because as soon as they're married, you can't find them. The men are much easier to track. Also, while men and women both worked, the men had careers and professions that got written down on things like census forms, and the women's jobs didn't matter. So finding all kinds of information about women is much harder, especially 100 years ago. And the things they did where they moved around the world and left family behind struck me as, again, brave for anybody and particularly brave for women, especially at the time.
Great. Well, I have dozens more questions that I could ask you, but I also wanted to leave an opportunity for those of you in the audience who have questions to chime in. So feel free to raise a hand, or we don't have to do the hand on Zoom here. We can actually raise the physical. I love when you're on Zoom and you say raise a hand and so people raise their physical hands. So who'd like, yes.
Yeah, I won't ask anything about reveal stuff because people haven't read the book, but I'll get you later about some things I have and some issues. And I want to hear about Harry and Francis. Okay. We gotta talk.
Yes.
But why don't you tell us a little bit about bootlegging?
So my great-grandfather, David, went into the cattle dealing business with his brothers. There were 5 brothers. One of the things that's unclear is what else they were dealing. There were rumors in the family that maybe they were bootleggers and involved with organized crime. So Canadian Prohibition started a few years before American Prohibition. So there are really, if you were a bootlegger in Canada, there are 2 waves that go back to back. The first is in the 19-teens when there's prohibition in Canada. So making liquor is illegal. And my family seems to have been involved in that. Whether my great-grandfather himself was is unclear. His brothers almost certainly were. Unclear whether he was or whether he was the good one. As soon as Canadian Prohibition ends, American Prohibition starts. So now it's not illegal to produce liquor in Canada, but it's illegal to export it to the United States, which they also continue to do. These were rumors that didn't have a lot of substantiation behind them until I found a business directory at the Jewish Heritage Center of Western Canada that during the 19-teens, when my great-grandfather was living full-time in Saskatchewan, where my grandmother spent half her childhood and never told anybody, he was a cattle dealer in rural Saskatchewan, and so were his brothers. And yet somehow at the exact same time in a business directory in Winnipeg, hundreds of miles away, they were running a business called the Manitoba Vinegar Company. I'm not saying they weren't making vinegar. I'm just saying it's unusual to think that they suddenly started making vinegar around the time Prohibition started, and once Prohibition was over, the vinegar company was gone. So yes, it does seem like they were involved in bootlegging. Also related fields like tax evasion. Some of his brothers, 2 of his brothers were busted in Canada's then largest tax evasion case to date in the 50s. But again, it's unclear whether my great-grandfather was the good brother who got out of that quickly or whether he just covered his tracks better and no one knew. It's really unclear. But yes, there does seem to be some kind of bootlegging and, prairie cowboy stuff and some really unexpected things about the family I found, where I was expecting, okay, they lived in the north end of Winnipeg. I know what the Lower East Side of New York was like. I live in New York. Other parts of my family came through New York. I can imagine what that's like, but I certainly couldn't imagine them, being cowboys on the prairie and bootlegging in the barn. That was never on my list of things to put in my family album.
Did you learn Yiddish as a child?
So I have what is a very common experience for North American Jews. My great-grandparents, broadly speaking, my great-grandparents spoke Yiddish as the first language. My grandparents spoke Yiddish as the second language. My parents learned Yiddish, but never formally. So they understand it. My father's sitting right there, am I right? Understand it, but not really fluent. And I picked up words, not through formal education, but because as a child, I didn't know they weren't English. Because my parents, I never realized Munich was a Yiddish word until I went to school with Gentiles and they said, what the hell are you saying? This is true of a whole slew of Yiddish words that I just assumed were English growing up. So that's where I come to Yiddish. So in terms of getting through like the Yiddish newspapers, I worked at the Forward for many years, the Forward in English, but we're adjacent to the Forwards in Yiddish. So I know Yiddishists and I used to see the Yiddish paper every day. I studied Hebrew in college and I studied German in high school. One of my fellow German classmates is sitting right here. And between the two of those, I can fudge my way very slowly through a Yiddish article. The trouble is, I'm usually, if I could probably get 80% of the words, 75, 80% of the words, I'm missing the important words, like, the verb. Yeah. So I found an obituary for a distant relative who I won't get into what's in the book, but I found a Yizkor notice, a memoriam notice in the Yiddish paper, and it's very short. And I said, I can get through this because it's only 2 sentences. The only part I didn't get was what she died of. And part of it's because I don't speak Yiddish, and part of it's because it was so non-literal. So I called a friend of mine who was my Yiddish translator for all my Yiddish resources. And she said, it says she died of a Besenwind. I said, what's a Besenwind? She said, it's like a cruel wind. But I don't know if that's being like metaphorical or if that's what they called pneumonia. I have no idea, but she died of a Besenwind.
Cruel wind.
A cruel wind. I don't know. So no, I don't speak Yiddish. You can tell I can funk my way through it, but no, I always miss the important words. But if you want to know the unimportant words, those I can usually get.
Hey, so as you may know, you and I probably went through those very similar journeys with our mothers over the last 10 years.
Yeah.
I don't know how much your mother, outside of the original story that you call bullshit, how much more did you rely on her for information? And how can you tell what was legitimate and what was not bullshit because she was told bullshit, but she made stuff up. Because I found that my mom couldn't tell you what happened 5 minutes ago, but she could tell you exactly what happened in 1944. She could tell you what happened off the Long Island Sound during World War II.
Of course.
But she couldn't tell you what happened last week.
It was challenging because by the time, so my mother's diagnosed with dementia in 2009. By 2010, when I'm making the video of her, it's only 9 months later. It's not that much later. And she hadn't declined that much. She was still very much herself. Although at the time I kept thinking, wow, look how much she slipped. Now I look back and think she was 85% there. Even then, she was already screwing up details. And I knew she was because she was a storyteller who told me these stories a million times. So by the time I was questioning her about the sniper story, I had heard it, let's say 12 million times. So it's even evident from the beginning. The story starts with my mother finding a photograph in her parents' drawer and her mother telling her that's actually my mother, her name is Sarah Brooks, and flipping over the photo. By the time she's telling me that story in 2010, months after diagnosis, she has already changed the story to, oh no, my mother never told me about Sarah Brooks. It was my father who told me. I said, it doesn't even make sense. First of all, your father never talked. And second of all, he wouldn't have known that story. It doesn't make sense. But she had already lost that. So I already knew she was not a reliable source. And it became problematic when I was trying to find cousins. The cousins, there were some that she knew of and maybe had met as a child, but we didn't really know. And then many more I'd never even heard of. She couldn't remember people's names already, in particular last names. And again, in particular, women's last names, because they weren't Fainston anymore. They'd changed their names when they got married, and I didn't know their husbands' names. So I didn't know whether these people were alive, whether they were in Canada or the United States. I didn't know where to find them. And she was zero help already on that front. So by the time I started this investigation, I couldn't depend on her for a single fact, like nothing. I could rely on my father for some facts, like some of the cousins' names. Trying to track people down was more a matter of, in some cases it took years, and accidentally finding a clue that helped me think, oh, now I can find this person. Or at one point I sent a note to the Jewish paper in Winnipeg asking for help in locating relatives, and he published my letter, and someone saw it who was not a relative but knew other people who were, and sent it to them, and they helped me find even more relatives who actually did have memories. So I had to branch out around my mother to get personal memories. By the time I started, it was too late. Anyone else? Yeah.
Who plays you in the movie? Because come on, it sounds like a movie, right? Doesn't it? It just, yeah, of course.
Well, I don't know who, but it would have to be someone very handsome and younger than me. That would be good. That'd be fine. I would take Jake.
I was going to go with Bradley Cooper.
I would. These are all. There are really no wrong answers. These are both excellent suggestions. Anybody else, or anyone else want to shout out a celebrity who? Yeah, Laura.
Can I give a defense of, I guess it was your grandmother who you said made up the bullshit story, but so getting shot in bed with your child sitting next to you is not so much different from getting shot on the front porch by someone driving by. There are a few details that are wrong.
It's true. There's a few details. What?
Is that really how she died? I mean, she was shot with children sleeping next to her.
She was shot in bed while she slept in the middle of the night in summer. Someone came and put a gun to her head.
It wasn't a wildly different story.
It was the core of the story is entirely right. Every detail of the story is entirely wrong. So I have to say, it took me years to find out the whole story. It didn't take me years to find out the basics of the story. That took a while because the name problem prevented me from finding stories about my great grandmother. By the time I found the quote unquote right spelling, the way that official documents would have spelled her name, that was a couple years into the journey. And I found that there was a death certificate on record. I sent away for that death certificate and found out that she'd been murdered because it's on the death certificate. And that's when I said, well, if a young woman was murdered, it would have been in the newspaper. Oh, and it was. So that was, again, you're right. The most important part was that she was murdered. The details, if my grandmother had been vague, it would have been much less entertaining, but she was very definitive in these bizarre details. And what was most fascinating is I tried to track down cousins. The first thing I asked them before I told them what really happened, because none of them knew. Some of them had a vague idea. Most had no idea. I wanted to know what stories they had heard to see if they'd ever heard this story about the drive-by sniper. And the answer is not one living soul had ever heard the story. Because I thought, well, maybe my grandmother's siblings all made up that story together and their children and grandchildren would have heard that. Nope, that was Ethel's little story. Now, she was 3 when this happened. So she probably wouldn't have remembered what happened. But yes, she most certainly did make this up. And I don't know why. Her brother, Harry, who was almost 6, who's the one who found his mother and was old enough to understand what he was looking at, I thought he might have passed down the most interesting story to his child, but no, he didn't. He didn't pass down the bullshit story or really any story. Yeah, Jerry.
So there are, you interviewed a lot of people about this, and there must have been like collisions in the stories where people just really the same information but differently or contradictory. And how did you wade through which was right, which was wrong?
So there's less of that than you think. The question was, when you talk to so many people, do they provide you with information that contradicts each other? And not as much as you think. The almost universal refrain I found when I contacted cousins, some relatively close, like my mother's first cousins, some my mother's second cousins who we never even knew existed, and some more distant. Almost everyone said the same thing when I contacted them. I really don't know much. And in truth, that was true. With one exception of one relative who had done a lot of digging into family tree stuff. They didn't know much. Let's say each person knew 3 things. There's almost no overlap. And 3 things times 20 is 60 details. That's a lot of details. And some of those details were very, let's say relevant or seemed central. And some of them were random and very interesting. Like my second cousin, so she's my generation, but she's younger than I am, she's in her 30s. She's the youngest person I talk to. She's the furthest from the murder of anyone I talk to. And I thought for sure she will know the absolute least. Except that her grandmother, who is the baby Anne, the one in the crib next to her mother when she was murdered, Anne never told her kids what happened, but she told her granddaughter what happened. Because her granddaughter was also named in her memory. And so as a child, when she had a school project and the teacher said, tell us about your family, she said, I want to know about the woman I'm named after. And her father said, I don't know. Ask your grandmother. And her grandmother opened up for the first time. And so there were things she told this younger woman that no one else in the family knew. And again, it wasn't like, whoa, who done it? It was, she said, well, I heard when they lived on the prairie in Saskatchewan that they were fairly poor and lived a sort of rustic life. Like they had a wash basin, they didn't have running water inside. This is the early 19-teens. It's not so unusual in the prairies. But they had a player piano. He said, that's a curious detail. It's of no relevance to the murder, but it's an interesting detail that no one else knew. She knew because her grandmother mentioned it. Her grandmother said, I remember when I was a child in Saskatchewan, we had a player piano. That's in the book. So there was much more of that than there was overlap. The point where I had to figure out who was telling the truth or which facts were reliable came up with the newspapers. Because there are 3 dailies that had wildly different reporting. And when they first of all, they changed from day to day. And second, each one of them was in a different place than the others. And they had different theories and different suspicions and different suspects they were sort of pushing. So what I tried to do was first see if there was general agreement and consensus. Some things there were, like who the initial suspects were, there was general consensus on that right off the bat. In other cases, I tried to look and say, here are 2 different newspapers have said there's one witness who claims to have heard the gunshot from the street. 1. 2 newspapers mention him, but they give him different names, related names. One calls him Polson, one calls him Folson. I said, well, which one's right? Well, one of them says, C.D. Polson, who had this profession and lived on this street, said the following, quote, and the other one just said, Mr. Folson said he saw someone. I said, okay, the one that has the details is probably the more reliable one. Or, especially with names, who were the next door neighbors? Were the Kasners or the Castaners, or did they have a different spelling, different papers spell their names differently? I looked at census reports and said, there was a Kastner family in the North End. That's probably them. There was no Kastner family. Yeah, that's not the right one. And some of it's just journalistic judgment saying, like, this fact is such an outlier, it doesn't make any sense. Like, if I believe that fact, I have to reorganize the whole case. So there are certainly sources that have facts that I didn't include, but I didn't include any facts that don't have sources that I think are reliable. Some of it's a judgment call, but it's usually based on some kind of weighing of evidence and reliability of sources. Some of the papers were clearly better than others. By the way, none of them were good. None. Really.
What, rural Saskatchewan?
Yeah, even in the middle of Winnipeg, the big issue, and this is still an issue today, is the language barrier is insurmountable. The newspapers and the police didn't have people who spoke other languages. The immigrants who had come were so recent, they'd only been there for a few years. And the cities, when people came to New York City and lived on the Lower East Side at the time, they were moving to a global metropolis of millions that had been around for quite a while. When people were moving to Winnipeg's North End at the same time, they were moving to a city that had basically come into existence 25 years before, had maybe 100,000 people, and the immigrants had all arrived within the past 5 years. So there was no one inside the police department or the newspapers who said, oh yeah, I'm the Yiddish expert. That person didn't exist. Or I'm the one I speak Ukrainian and Russian and also German and Polish, and I'll go out and interview all the neighbors. So you have the people on the street are speaking many different languages and playing a game of telephone, spreading gossip. And it's gossip. A lot of it's nonsense. And then it's being translated by journalists who I don't think are very good. So what comes out in the newspapers is often a really weird jumble of facts and half-truths and things that don't pan out at all.
Challenging.
Yeah, that's challenging. That's why it didn't take me 2 weeks. Anybody else? If not, I'm thrilled that you all came, and thank you again, Aaron.
And please make sure that this bookstore has no copies left at the end of the.
Please buy books. I'm happy to sign them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. We have some time to mingle about and chat if you want to get your book signed. Or grab a copy if you don't have one.
Thanks. I'm really excited to read it. Thanks a lot. Really, thanks.
Oh, thank you.